My name is Clara Mitchell, and I'm 60 years old, a retired nurse who spent 38 years healing others' wounds, a devoted sister who believed that family ties could heal any fracture, and a woman who learned too late that sometimes the people we love most are the very ones who will cut us deepest without a moment's hesitation or regret. For my entire adult life, I poured my heart and soul into holding our small family together, believing that unconditional love and endless sacrifice could overcome any obstacle life might place in our path. When my younger brother Tom's hardware store teetered on the edge of bankruptcy 12 years ago, I didn't hesitate to loan him $30,000 from my retirement savings money I'd carefully accumulated through decades of working double shifts and living frugally. When his drinking problem destroyed his marriage and left his 10-year-old daughter Emily without proper care, I opened my home and my heart to that confused, frightened child, raising her as my own for 3 precious years, while Tom struggled to find his footing. When our parents passed away and left us their beloved farmland, I fought to preserve every acre, paying taxes and maintenance costs from my nursing salary because I believed that land represented our family's legacy and future security. I gave my savings, my strength, my unwavering devotion to keep our family whole and connected, believing that love this deep and sacrifice this complete would create unbreakable bonds between us. I thought that caring for Emily during her most vulnerable years would earn me a special place in her heart, that saving Tom's business would secure his gratitude and respect, that protecting our family's heritage would guarantee my own place in the legacy I'd worked so hard to preserve. Then came last month's family reunion, a gathering I'd organized and funded to celebrate what I thought was our strong, loving family unit. I arrived at the farmhouse feeling proud of what we'd built together, excited to share plans for preserving the land for future generations. But by the end of that weekend, everything I'd believed about family loyalty and sibling bonds had crumbled into dust that tasted bitter as poison on my tongue. My arthritis had been particularly painful that weekend, leaving my hands stiff and my thinking foggy from the medication I'd been taking to manage the constant aching in my joints. When Tom and his wife Sheila presented me with what they called a simple trust document to protect the family assets, I signed it without reading the fine print, trusting the brother I'd spent a lifetime supporting and protecting. The truth came out during Sunday dinner, delivered with the casual cruelty of people discussing the weather. The document I'd signed wasn't a trust to protect our family's legacy. It was a transfer deed that gave Tom and Sheila complete ownership of the farmland I'd spent 15 years preserving. "You're too old to manage it properly anyway," Sheila said, with a cold smile that revealed years of hidden resentment. Tom nodded in agreement, adding words that cut through my heart like a surgeon's blade. "Besides, Clara, you owe me. All those years of help and loans, it's time to pay up." Standing in the farmhouse kitchen, where our mother had taught me to bake bread, and our father had told us stories of his own childhood, I felt something shatter inside me that I knew would never heal completely. But as I stood there utterly destroyed by the betrayal of the people I'd loved most in the world, something unexpected began to stir in the deepest part of my soul. What Tom didn't know, what he'd forgotten in his greed and arrogance, was that our father had kept meticulous records of everything that happened in our family. Hidden in my bedroom closet, stored in a box Tom had never bothered to explore, was Dad's personal journal, documenting Tom's early embezzlement from the hardware store financial crimes he'd committed, and I'd covered up to protect his reputation and our family's honor. My brother was about to learn that the sister who'd sacrificed everything to save him was more than capable of using that same evidence to destroy him completely. The shock of discovering what I'd actually signed took several hours to fully register, like the delayed pain that follows a serious injury. By Monday morning, when the legal implications had crystallized in my mind with horrible clarity, I knew I had to confront Tom and Sheila about what they'd done to me while I was vulnerable and trusting. I found them at the farmhouse, already measuring rooms and discussing renovation plans, as if the property had been theirs for years rather than ours. Tom was standing in our father's old workshop, pointing out structural changes he wanted to make, while Sheila examined the antique furniture with the calculating eye of someone planning a profitable estate sale. The casual way they discussed dismantling our family's history revealed the true depth of their disrespect for everything our parents had built and preserved. "Tom," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and growing anger, "we need to talk about what happened yesterday, about that document you had me sign. I don't think I understood what I was agreeing to, and I'd like to review the terms more carefully." Emily, now 22, and apparently a full participant in her father's schemes, pulled out her phone and began recording our conversation with the kind of casual cruelty that only young people seem capable of inflicting on their elders. "This is going to be hilarious," she announced to her social media followers, apparently live streaming our family crisis for entertainment. "My Aunt Clara is about to have a meltdown because she finally realized she's not in charge anymore." The dismissive way they treated my legitimate concerns revealed that this betrayal had been planned long in advance, not the spontaneous decision they'd presented it as during our reunion. Tom barely looked up from his renovation plans as he delivered his response with practiced indifference. "Clara, you signed a legal document transferring ownership of family property to people who are actually capable of managing it responsibly," he said, with the patronizing tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "You've been treating this land like your personal kingdom for years, making decisions without consulting anyone else in the family. It's time for responsible adults to take control." But it was Sheila who revealed the true scope of their greed and the extent of their plans for my systematic dispossession. She approached me with a thick folder of additional documents, her expression carrying the satisfied malice of someone who'd been planning this moment for months or even years. "Since we're being honest about family responsibilities," Sheila said, spreading papers across our father's old kitchen table like a prosecutor presenting evidence, "let's discuss the other changes that need to happen. This house, for instance. It's far too large and expensive for a single woman living on a nurse's pension. The property taxes alone are eating into resources that should be invested in the family's future development plans." The demands that followed were so outrageous, they actually took my breath away, revealing a level of entitlement and callousness that I'd never suspected existed beneath their surface politeness during family gatherings. Sheila wanted me to deed my home to them, immediately claiming it was part of the family legacy that needed to be managed by people with actual business experience and financial acumen. Tom joined her assault with his own carefully rehearsed list of grievances and expectations, clearly having spent considerable time planning the systematic destruction of my independence and security. "The money you've been hoarding in your savings account should be invested in our development plans for the farmland," he announced with the authority of someone who'd already made irreversible decisions. "We're planning to lease sections to commercial developers, and the startup costs require significant capital investment." Emily continued filming our conversation while providing her own commentary for her social media audience, describing me as a greedy old woman who'd been hoarding family wealth while younger generations struggled to establish themselves financially. The casual cruelty of her public humiliation revealed how completely She'd been turned against me by parents who saw my love and sacrifice as weakness to be exploited. My Aunt Clara has been living like a queen while the rest of us scraped by, Emily announced to her phone camera, apparently broadcasting our private family crisis to anyone willing to watch. She's been sitting on all this money and property while Dad's business struggled, and I had to take out student loans. Finally, justice is being served. The lies poured from her mouth with the practiced ease of someone who'd been coached in this narrative for months, painting me as a selfish hoarder, rather than the woman who'd raised her during the most difficult years of her childhood. According to Emily's version of events, I'd been a burden rather than a blessing, a controlling figure who'd interfered with their family's happiness rather than the sister who'd sacrificed her own retirement security to help them survive their crises. But Sheila's attack on my character was even more systematic and devastating, clearly designed to destroy any community support I might seek in fighting their theft of my property and savings. She'd already begun spreading rumors at our church and among our neighbors, painting me as a selfish spinster who'd manipulated family relationships to maintain control over assets that rightfully belonged to the younger generation. Clara has been playing the martyr for years, Sheila announced with obvious satisfaction at finally being able to express her true feelings, claiming she sacrificed for the family when really she was just buying influence and control. She's unfit to manage property or make important financial decisions, and it's time for people with actual business sense to take charge of family assets. The demands that followed revealed the full scope of their plans for my systematic impoverishment and isolation. They wanted me to pay their legal fees for processing the land transfer, as if I should be grateful for the privilege of being robbed. They expected me to vacate my home within 30 days so they could begin renovations that would increase its value for their eventual sale. They demanded that I sell my grandmother's jewelry and turn the proceeds over to them for their development fund. Think of it as finally paying your fair share, Tom said, with the casual cruelty of someone who'd convinced himself that theft was actually justice. You've been living off family resources for years, while the rest of us carried the real burdens. Emily's college education, my business expenses, the cost of maintaining family relationships that you've taken for granted. It's time to settle accounts. As I listened to them calmly discuss dismantling my entire life as if I were already dead, I felt the last vestiges of my faith in family love slip away like water through a broken dam. These people weren't my family anymore. They were predators who'd been circling for years, waiting for me to become vulnerable enough to exploit completely. But somewhere in the depths of my devastation, something harder and more dangerous was beginning to emerge. The woman who'd spent 38 years protecting patients from those who would harm them was starting to remember what real consequences looked like when they were delivered by someone who understood the true cost of betrayal and cruelty. The weeks that followed that devastating confrontation brought a steady escalation of demands and humiliations that revealed the true scope of their plans for my complete destruction. Sheila called daily with new requirements, each one more degrading than the last, clearly testing to see how much abuse I would tolerate before breaking entirely under the pressure of their coordinated assault. Clara, she announced during one particularly cruel phone call, Tom and I have been discussing your employment situation, and we think it's time you started contributing meaningfully to this family's welfare instead of just living off your dead parents' generosity. There's a part-time position available at the medical supply company downtown. It's only $12 an hour, but at least you'd be earning your keep instead of being a drain on family resources. The suggestion that I take a minimum wage job at 60 years old with arthritis that made simple tasks increasingly difficult and painful revealed their complete disregard for my health dignity and decades of professional experience as a registered nurse. But Sheila wasn't finished with her catalog of ways I could contribute to their financial schemes and development plans, and we've decided to move forward with leasing the farmland to Hartwell Development Corporation. She continued with the casual authority of someone who'd already signed irreversible contracts. The monthly lease payments will provide excellent income for the family trust, and Tom has every right to make these decisions now that he's the legal owner of the property. The farmland she was discussing so casually represented 4 generations of my family's heritage soil that my great-grandfather had cleared with his own hands, and my father had worked every day until his death 5 years ago. Tom had no emotional connection to that land beyond its monetary value, no understanding of the sweat and sacrifice that had preserved it through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless family crises. But the cruelest revelation was still to come, delivered with Emily's casual disregard for the pain her words would inflict on someone who'd loved her like a daughter during her most vulnerable years. "Aunt Clara," she said during a phone call that I'd hoped might lead to some kind of reconciliation, "Dad thinks you should sign over your pension benefits to help fund my graduate school. Since you raised me for those 3 years, it's only fair that you invest in my future education and career prospects." It was during these conversations, as I listened to them calmly discuss stealing everything I'd worked 40 years to build, that the painful truth finally crystallized in my mind with devastating clarity. I wasn't Tom's sister in his eyes anymore. Perhaps I never had been anything more than a convenient source of financial support and free childcare. I was a resource to be exploited until I was completely drained, then discarded like a broken appliance that had outlived its usefulness. Every sacrifice I'd made, every boundary I'd crossed to help them, every time I'd chosen their needs over my own security and happiness had been cataloged in their minds as evidence of my obligation to continue providing unlimited support rather than recognition of my extraordinary generosity and love. I thought about those 3 years when I'd essentially become Emily's mother while Tom battled his alcohol addiction and struggled through his divorce. 7-year-old Emily had needed stability, consistency, and unconditional love during the most traumatic period of her young life. I'd given up my travel plans, my dating prospects, my entire social life to provide her with the security her father couldn't give her during his personal crisis. The exhaustion had been overwhelming. Chasing after a young child in my 40s, helping with homework every night, attending school conferences and birthday parties and ballet recitals, all while working full-time at the hospital and worrying constantly about Tom's sobriety and emotional stability. My doctor had warned me that the stress was affecting my blood pressure and joint health, that I needed to slow down and take better care of myself. But I'd ignored his advice because Emily needed me. What I'd hidden from everyone, including Tom, was how much those 3 years had cost me physically and emotionally. The chronic fatigue that I'd attributed to normal aging, the joint pain that had gradually worsened into the arthritis that now limited my mobility, the social isolation that had resulted from dedicating every free moment to childcare instead of maintaining my own friendships and interests. I'd been slowly destroying my own health and future to protect Tom's daughter. And when my sacrifices were no longer needed, they'd been forgotten rather than appreciated. Emily had returned to her father's care with no acknowledgement of what I'd given up for her welfare, no gratitude for the stability I'd provided during her most vulnerable years. When Tom learned about the true cost of my sacrifice through our current crisis, his reaction revealed the stunning depth of his selfishness and complete inability to accept responsibility for his own choices and their consequences. Instead of gratitude or remorse, he offered only blame and resentment, as if I'd somehow forced him to abandon his daughter during his personal problems rather than volunteering to help him through a crisis. "You always did this, Clara," he said, with the casual cruelty of someone who'd spent years justifying his exploitation of my generosity. "You always made these grand gestures and then expected everyone to be grateful forever. Nobody asked you to ruin your health raising Emily. You did it because you needed to feel important and indispensable, because you couldn't stand the idea of not being the center of everyone's problems." Sheila joined his attack with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased to finally have permission to express the resentment she'd been harboring since the day she'd married into our family. "The truth is, Clara, your so-called sacrifices weren't really about helping Tom or Emily. They were about feeding your own ego, about making yourself feel like some kind of saint, so you could guilt everyone into treating you like family royalty. Well, the saint act isn't working anymore. We see right through it." But the most devastating blow came when Tom accused me of using my arthritis as emotional manipulation, claiming that I was exaggerating my pain and limitations to gain sympathy and avoid taking responsibility for my own financial future. "You've been milking this arthritis diagnosis for 2 years, Clara, acting like you're disabled when the doctor said it's completely manageable with proper medication and exercise. I think you're enjoying being the victim too much to actually take care of yourself." The solutions they proposed for my situation revealed the true scope of their cruelty and their complete disregard for my dignity or well-being. Sheila had found what she called the perfect living arrangement. For someone in my financial position, a shared apartment with 3 other elderly women in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town. The monthly rent would consume most of my nursing pension, leaving me with barely enough for food and medication, but they assured me it would be much more appropriate for someone who could no longer afford to maintain her own home. "Think of it as downsizing," Emily said with false cheerfulness that didn't mask her obvious excitement at my downfall. "You'll have much less responsibility and stress, and Dad will have the resources he needs to provide properly for his real family. It's a win-win situation for everyone who actually matters." The paperwork they wanted me to sign would strip away every last vestige of my financial independence and security. Bank account changes that would add Tom as primary owner of my savings, with me listed as a secondary beneficiary on my own money. Insurance policy modifications that would make Emily the sole beneficiary of my life, insurance and retirement accounts. Property transfer forms that would deed my house to Tom immediately rather than waiting for my death. As I listened to them outline their plans for my systematic impoverishment and isolation, I felt something inside me die. The trusting, self-sacrificing sister who'd believed that love could overcome any obstacle was taking her last breath. But in that death, something harder and infinitely more dangerous was being born. Something that remembered what it felt like to fight for patients who were being neglected to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit their weakness. They thought they were dealing with a broken old woman who would accept their abuse and disappear quietly into subsidized housing for discarded elderly people. They had no idea they'd just awakened a retired nurse who'd spent 38 years dealing with bullies and incompetent administrators, someone who understood exactly how to document abuse and deliver consequences that would echo through generations. The final assault on my dignity and independence came on a Friday morning in late September. delivered with the kind of calculated precision that suggested weeks of planning and legal consultation. Tom arrived at my front door at 7 a.m. sharp, accompanied by Sheila and a process server who handed me official eviction papers with the professional efficiency of someone who'd handled many similar family disputes. Clara, Tom announced without any pretense of brotherly affection or concern for my feelings, you have 5 days to vacate this property so we can begin the renovations necessary to prepare it for sale. The attorney has confirmed that the deed transfer gives us complete legal authority to determine the timing and terms of your departure. The man in the cheap suit stepped forward with a thick envelope of legal documents, apparently expecting me to sign additional papers that would formalize my surrender of any remaining claims to property I'd considered my home for 15 years. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm serving you with formal notice of eviction and property transfer. You have 120 hours to remove your personal belongings and surrender all keys to the new legal owners. Emily, now apparently a full partner in their conspiracy, rather than just an observer, had positioned herself near my front window with her phone camera rolling, clearly planning to document my humiliation for her social media audience. This is going to be epic, she announced to her followers, apparently live streaming what she expected would be my complete breakdown. My Aunt Clara is about to get a reality check about who actually owns what in this family. But the cruelest blow was still to come, delivered through a violation of my privacy that revealed the true scope of their planning and their complete disregard for any boundaries of decency or family loyalty. Emily had somehow gained access to my email account and had been sending messages to my friends and former colleagues, spreading lies about my mental health and creating the impression that I was no longer capable of maintaining normal relationships. We thought you should know, Sheila said, with obvious satisfaction at this latest humiliation, that Emily has been helping you manage your correspondence with people who've been worried about your increasingly erratic behavior. She's been explaining to your friends that you're going through a difficult adjustment period and might not be thinking clearly about family relationships and financial responsibilities. The emails Emily had sent in my name were masterpieces of character assassination disguised as concerned explanations for my supposed decline. According to these fabricated messages, I'd been displaying signs of paranoid delusions, making wild accusations against family members who were trying to help me, and refusing to accept assistance with managing my affairs despite obvious cognitive decline. Dear Margaret, one email read, apparently sent to my closest friend from nursing school. I wanted to explain why I might seem confused or upset if you try to contact me. My family has been trying to help me transition to a more appropriate living situation, but I've been resistant to change and suspicious of their motives. Please don't take anything I say about them seriously, as I'm obviously not thinking clearly these days. As I stood in my own living room, reading emails that had been sent in my name to destroy my relationships and isolate me from any potential sources of support, I felt the last connection to my old life snap like a rope under unbearable tension. The woman who'd believed in the power of family love to overcome any obstacle was dying in that moment, killed by cruelty so calculated and complete that it left no room for hope or reconciliation. But even as they systematically dismantled my life around me, I held on to one last desperate hope that my brother retained some small vestige of the boy I'd protected and nurtured some fragment of conscience that might be reached through a sister's love. I approached him with tears streaming down my face, my voice breaking with the weight of 60 years of shared history. Tommy, I whispered, using the childhood nickname I hadn't spoken in decades. Please remember who we used to be to each other. Remember when you had pneumonia and I sat by your bed for 3 days straight because you were afraid to be alone. Remember when Dad died and we held each other and promised we'd always take care of each other. Remember when you brought Emily to me because you knew I'd love her like my own daughter. Can't you find some way to remember that love? The silence that greeted my desperate plea was more devastating than any cruel words could have been. Tom's face remained stone cold as he watched me pour out my heart, clearly unmoved by memories that had once meant everything to both of us. His refusal to even acknowledge my pain confirmed what I'd been trying to deny for weeks. The brother I'd loved and protected and sacrificed for was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to his financial ambitions. But Sheila wasn't content to let my destruction proceed with even the dignity of silence. She approached my mailbox with a can of red spray paint and began defacing it with words designed to ensure that my neighbors would see me as the problem rather than the victim of family abuse. Selfish witch, she wrote in large letters across the front of my mailbox, making sure the message would be visible to everyone who passed my house. Finally, getting what she deserves. Emily's contribution to this final humiliation was equally calculated and cruel. She posted a celebration message on her social media accounts, complete with photos of the eviction papers and excited commentary about my downfall. Clara's finally out, she wrote with obvious satisfaction. No more fake family drama, no more guilt trips, no more pretending to care about someone who never really cared about us. Justice at last. But it was Tom's final dismissal that cut deepest, delivered with the casual indifference of someone discussing the disposal of unwanted furniture. Clara, you need to understand that your role in this family ended when our parents died. You've been clinging to relevance for 5 years, but you're simply not important to our future anymore. You're irrelevant. Something inside me snapped, then like a wire stretched beyond its breaking point, finally giving way under unbearable tension. The words that poured out of me carried 40 years of buried pain, sacrifice, and love that had been thrown back in my face with calculated cruelty. You want to know what kind of sister I really am? Tom. I said, my voice rising until it filled the room like thunder rolling across a summer sky. You want to understand exactly what you're throwing away in your greed and selfishness. Let me tell you about a secret I've been keeping for 25 years to protect your reputation and our family's honor. The room went silent, except for Emily's phone camera, still recording, apparently capturing what she expected would be my final breakdown. But I wasn't finished. The dam had burst after decades of holding back, and everything came flooding out in a torrent of truth that would change our family dynamics forever. When you were 28 years old and working at Henderson's Hardware before you bought your own store, you were stealing from the register and the inventory accounts. Dad knew about it because he was still friendly with old Mr. Henderson, and they talked about the discrepancies they couldn't explain. You were taking cash from daily sales and falsifying inventory reports to cover the theft. Tom's face had gone pale, but I continued relentlessly needing him to understand the full scope of what his cruelty was destroying. Dad documented everything in his journal because he was planning to confront you and demand that you make restitution before the theft was discovered by the store's accountants. He calculated that you'd stolen over $8,000 during the 6 months before you quit to start your own business. $8,000 that would have sent you to prison if the authorities had been notified. My voice cracked with the weight of memories I'd buried for decades, but I forced myself to continue. I begged Dad not to expose you because I knew it would destroy your future and Emily's security. I convinced him to let me handle it quietly, and I used my savings to repay Henderson's Hardware anonymously. I told them it was an accounting error that had been discovered and corrected, and they agreed not to pursue the matter further. The devastation on Tom's face was complete and absolute, but I wasn't finished exposing the magnitude of the secret I'd protected for 25 years. Dad's journal documents everything. I continued, my voice steady now, with the calm that comes from finally speaking a truth that's been locked away too long. The dates of your theft, the amounts you stole, the methods you used to cover up the missing money. It also documents my repayment and the agreement I made with Mr. Henderson to keep the matter private to protect our family's reputation. As the full weight of my revelation settled over the room, I looked directly at Emily's phone camera, knowing that she was broadcasting this moment to her social media followers, and that Tom's criminal past was now being documented for posterity. So when you ask what kind of sister I am, Tom, when you question my place in this family or my right to be treated with basic human dignity, remember this moment. Remember that the woman you're throwing away like garbage is the same woman who saved you from federal prison and protected your reputation for 25 years. And remember that the evidence of your crimes is still safely stored in my closet, along with Dad's journal, documenting my sacrifice to save your worthless, ungrateful hide. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Tom stood frozen in my living room, his face cycling through shock recognition, and what might have been the first genuine fear he'd felt in years. Emily's phone had captured everything, and I could see her struggling to understand whether she should continue broadcasting or try to protect her father from the consequences of his own criminal behavior. The woman who'd spent 25 years protecting Tom from the consequences of his own crimes was finally ready to let the world see exactly who he really was, and she was more than capable of using that same evidence to teach him the most expensive lesson of his miserable, ungrateful life. The silence that followed my revelation about Tom's embezzlement stretched like a taut wire between us, heavy with the weight of 25 years of hidden truth finally exposed to the harsh light of day. Tom stood frozen in my living room, his face cycling through emotions I'd never seen before. Shock, recognition, confusion, and something that might have been genuine fear if he'd been capable of such honest feeling. Emily's phone continued recording, apparently capturing what she'd expected would be my complete breakdown, but had instead become documentation of her father's criminal past. But I was beyond caring about their emotional states or their increasingly desperate attempts to process the magnitude of what I just revealed. The broken, pleading sister they'd been systematically destroying was gone forever, replaced by someone who'd finally remembered her own strength and worth after decades of defining herself through their needs and demands. "I'm done, Tom," I said, my voice carrying the calm finality of someone who'd finally reached the end of a very long, very painful road. "I'm done being your victim, your scapegoat, your convenient source of money and free labor. I'm done protecting you from the consequences of choices you made as an adult man who knew exactly what he was doing when he stole from his employer and betrayed his family's trust." I walked to my bedroom and retrieved the wooden box where I'd kept our father's journal for 5 years, handling it with the reverence it deserved as the key to everything that would follow. The leather-bound book contained not just evidence of Tom's crimes, but detailed records of every sacrifice I'd made to protect him, every lie I'd told to preserve our family's reputation, every dollar I'd spent to keep him out of prison. "You want to know what real consequences look like, Tom?" I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word as decades of suppressed anger finally found their voice. You're about to face the truth about what kind of man you really are, what kind of brother you've always been underneath all my protection and enabling. I'm not your doormat anymore, Tom. I'm the woman who's going to make sure you finally pay for what you've done to me and to every person you've ever stolen from. The crash that came from Emily's direction told me she dropped her phone in shock, probably realizing for the first time that her social media documentation of my breakdown had actually become evidence of her father's criminal confession and her own participation in elder abuse. When Tom finally found his voice, it carried all the desperate rage of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time, someone who'd built his entire adult life on a foundation of lies and stolen money that could crumble at any moment. "You're bluffing," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic and fury. "You wouldn't destroy your own brother. You've spent your whole life protecting me, and you're not going to throw that away now because you're angry about some property transfers that are perfectly legal." But Sheila's response revealed the depths of their delusion about my character and capabilities. Their complete inability to recognize that the woman they'd been abusing possessed both the evidence and the determination to destroy them completely. "She's obviously having some kind of mental breakdown," she announced to the room as if I weren't standing right there, holding documentation of their conspiracy. "The stress of losing her home has clearly affected her judgment. Nobody's going to believe the ramblings of a bitter old woman who's obviously suffering from age-related cognitive decline." Emily, scrambling to retrieve her phone and apparently unsure whether to continue broadcasting or try to protect her father, added her own desperate contribution to their rapidly crumbling facade. "Aunt Clara is obviously confused and making things up because she's upset about the family business decisions. These wild accusations about Dad are just her way of trying to get revenge for losing the farmland. Their attempts to gaslight me into believing I was mentally incompetent were so transparent and pathetic that I actually smiled, an expression that clearly startled them, since they'd probably expected tears and pleading rather than the calm confidence of someone who held all the real power in our relationship. But I was beyond engaging with their manipulative tactics or their increasingly frantic attempts to maintain control over a narrative that was no longer theirs to dictate. I had preparations to make evidence, to organize legal proceedings to initiate. For the first time in months, I had a purpose beyond mere survival, a mission that would require all the skills I developed during 38 years of protecting patients from those who would harm them. I stopped answering Tom's increasingly desperate phone calls, stopped responding to Sheila's threatening voicemails, stopped engaging with any of their attempts to manipulate me back into the role of grateful victim. Instead, I focused on the practical steps necessary to reclaim my independence and protect myself from their continued predation. The senior support group I'd found at the community center became my lifeline during those first difficult weeks of rebuilding my sense of self-worth and planning my counterattack. 12 elderly people gathered every Thursday evening to share their stories of family betrayal, financial exploitation, and the particular challenges that came with aging in a society that often viewed elderly people as burdens rather than valuable human beings with rights and dignity. When I shared my story with the group, the response was immediate and powerful. Several members had similar experiences of adult children or relatives who'd stolen from them, manipulated them, or tried to have them declared incompetent to gain access to their assets. The support and validation I received from people who truly understood what I was going through, gave me strength I hadn't felt since before our parents' deaths. The letter I wrote to Tom 3 days later was brief, precise, and completely devoid of the sisterly warmth that had characterized our relationship for 60 years. I outlined exactly what evidence I possessed, what charges he would face if I chose to pursue them, and what his life would look like when his criminal past became public knowledge in our small community. Your greed will be your downfall, Tom. I wrote in my careful handwriting, and when it happens, I'll be free from the burden of protecting someone who was never worth the sacrifice. You chose theft over honesty, cruelty over gratitude, betrayal over family loyalty. Now you can live with the consequences of those choices without any help or protection from me. I mailed the letter certified delivery, ensuring that Tom would have to sign for it personally and acknowledge that he'd received my final communication as his sister. Then I blocked his number, deleted his email address from my contacts, and began the process of building a life that had no room for people who saw my love as weakness and my generosity as stupidity. But Tom and his accomplices weren't prepared to surrender without a fight, and their counterattack came with all the desperation of people who'd suddenly realized they were facing genuine consequences for their actions. Sheila began calling my former nursing colleagues and neighbors, spreading rumors that I was suffering from advanced dementia and had been making wild accusations against family members who were trying to help me transition to appropriate care. Clara's completely lost touch with reality. She told anyone who would listen, apparently believing that destroying my reputation would somehow neutralize the evidence I held against Tom. She's been displaying signs of paranoid delusions for months, accusing innocent family members of stealing from her when they're actually trying to protect her from making dangerous financial decisions that could leave her homeless and destitute. Emily took a different approach, escalating her social media campaign with increasingly vicious posts that accused me of theft, fraud, and elder abuse against my own family. According to her fabricated narrative, I'd been stealing from Tom's business for years, manipulating family finances to maintain control over assets that rightfully belonged to the younger generation. My Aunt Clara has finally shown her true colors. Emily posted with obvious satisfaction at finally being able to express her manufactured resentment. She's been playing the victim while actually being the predator, stealing from hardworking family members, and then crying abuse when we tried to stop her criminal behavior. Justice is finally being served. But their lies and threats no longer had the power to wound me. I discovered something precious in the ashes of our destroyed relationship, the liberating knowledge that I didn't need their approval, their love, or their presence in my life to be happy and fulfilled. The woman who'd spent 60 years defining herself as Tom's protective older sister was gone, replaced by someone who remembered what it felt like to be valued for her own worth rather than her usefulness to ungrateful relatives. For the first time since our parents' deaths, I felt genuinely excited about the future I was building, with my own hands and my own choices. The Thursday evening support group at the community center had become my anchor during the turbulent weeks following my break with Tom's toxic influence, a place where my story was met with understanding rather than judgment, where my pain was validated rather than dismissed. When I shared the full details of Tom's embezzlement and my decades of covering up his crimes, the response from my fellow survivors was both immediate and transformative. Clara, said Rachel Martinez, a retired family law attorney who joined our group after her own son had tried to have her declared incompetent to steal her retirement savings. What you've described isn't just family conflict, It's systematic elder financial abuse, combined with fraud that may still be prosecutable despite the passage of time. I'd like to help you explore your legal options for recovering your stolen property. Rachel's offer to provide legal assistance pro bono felt like a gift from the universe, a chance to transform my personal pain into genuine justice, rather than simply accepting my losses and trying to move forward. Within a week, she'd reviewed Dad's journal, analyzed the fraudulent trust document, and confirmed that Tom's theft of my farmland could be reversed through the courts with the right evidence and legal strategy. The beauty of this case, Rachel explained as we sat in her modest office reviewing decades of documentation, is that your father was meticulous about record keeping. We have clear evidence of Tom's criminal history, proof of your financial contributions to preserving the family land, and documentation of coercion and fraud in the so-called trust agreement you were manipulated into signing. But Rachel offered me something even more valuable than legal representation. She introduced me to the Heritage Preservation Coalition, a statewide organization dedicated to protecting family farmlands from commercial development and helping elderly landowners resist pressure from relatives who wanted to sell heritage property for short-term profit. Clara said Margaret Foster, the coalition's director, and a woman whose own family had tried to force her to sell her great-grandfather's farm for a shopping center development. Your story represents exactly the kind of case we were founded to address. We need someone with your experience and passion to coordinate our efforts in this region. The opportunity to transform my personal battle into a force for protecting other vulnerable elderly landowners felt like discovering my true calling after years of defining myself solely through family relationships. Within a month, I was leading the coalition's Central Valley Heritage Project, organizing workshops for elderly farmers and their families about legal protections available against fraudulent property transfers and predatory development schemes. The work was challenging and emotionally demanding, but it connected me with dozens of people who'd survived experiences similar to mine and were eager to help protect others from the same kind of exploitation. For the first time since our parents' deaths, I felt like I was part of a community that valued my contributions rather than simply tolerating my presence. The coalition's annual fundraising event was held on a crisp Saturday evening in November, bringing together local philanthropists, government officials, and community leaders who supported our mission of preserving agricultural heritage and protecting elderly landowners from family financial abuse. As the coordinator of our regional project, I'd been invited to present our work and request funding for expanded legal assistance programs. I was reviewing my presentation notes backstage when I spotted a familiar figure near the donor reception area, and my heart sank with the recognition of trouble approaching like storm clouds on an otherwise perfect evening. Sheila stood among a group of well-dressed developers and real estate investors wearing an expensive cocktail dress and clearly working to position herself as someone with influence and insider knowledge about upcoming land development opportunities. Our eyes met across the crowded reception hall, and I saw the same predatory gleam that had driven her attacks on my character and property. She approached with the confident stride of someone who believed she still held the power to humiliate and destroy me, apparently convinced that my new role with the Heritage Coalition was just another manifestation of my supposed mental decline, rather than evidence of my resilience and recovery. Well, well, she said loudly enough for nearby donors and board members to hear, if it isn't Clara Mitchell, how absolutely surprising to see you here. I had no idea that people who make false accusations against their own families were welcome at respectable community organizations. The calculated cruelty of her words was designed to immediately establish me as someone of questionable character in front of people whose respect and support I needed for our preservation work. Several attendees shifted uncomfortably clearly, unsure how to process this unexpected personal attack in what should have been a positive, collaborative environment focused on protecting agricultural heritage. I suppose desperate people will try anything to rehabilitate their reputations after destroying family relationships with lies and manipulation. Sheila continued warming to her theme with obvious pleasure. But really, Clara, don't you think it's a bit pathetic for a washed-up nurse to pretend she understands complex land development issues? These good people should know what kind of person they're really dealing with. She gestured dismissively at my simple black dress and modest jewelry, clearly intending to highlight the contrast with her own expensive appearance and what she assumed was my diminished social status. I mean, look at her. Does this look like someone who has the credibility or expertise to advise others about property management? She's obviously here looking for handouts and sympathy, not offering genuine leadership to the community. The murmur that rippled through our small audience was uncomfortable and uncertain exactly the reaction Sheila had been hoping to provoke. Some faces showed confusion about this unexpected personal drama, while others reflected the kind of doubt that comes from hearing accusations from someone who presented herself as having insider knowledge about family situations. But I'd spent 38 years handling difficult situations in front of audiences far more challenging than this group of well-intentioned community leaders. I waited for Sheila to finish her character assassination, letting her expose the full extent of her malice and desperation before responding with the calm authority that had served me well in countless hospital staff meetings and patient family conferences. When my turn came to address the gathering, I approached the podium with a confidence born from knowing that authentic experience resonated more deeply than superficial appearances, that truth was more powerful than manipulation when presented with clarity and conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, I began my voice carrying clearly through the now silent auditorium. I want to share with you a story that illustrates exactly why the Heritage Preservation Coalition's work is so desperately needed in communities like ours. It's the story of a 60-year-old woman who spent her life preserving her family's farmland, only to have that land stolen through fraud and coercion by relatives who saw her love as weakness and her generosity as opportunity. Instead of defending myself against Sheila's accusations, I simply told my story, sharing the real facts about family betrayal, financial exploitation, and the systematic abuse that elderly landowners faced when their children viewed heritage property as nothing more than potential profit. I described Tom's embezzlement, the fraudulent trust document, and the coordinated campaign to have me declared incompetent so they could steal everything our family had preserved for 4 generations. The room was completely silent as I presented evidence of the fraud that had been perpetrated against me. But more than that, I connected my personal experience to the broader pattern of exploitation that the coalition existed to prevent and prosecute. When I finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in spontaneous applause that lasted for several minutes. Margaret Foster approached the podium with obvious pride and excitement, announcing that our regional project had just received a $25,000 emergency grant from the State Attorney General's office to provide immediate legal assistance to elderly victims of family land fraud. Clara's courage in sharing her story and her expertise in coordinating our legal response efforts Margaret announced to the assembled crowd, represents exactly the kind of authentic leadership that creates real change in our communities. Her work has already helped dozens of elderly landowners protect themselves from family financial exploitation, and this funding will allow us to reach hundreds more people who need these vital resources. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and complete. Faces that had shown uncertainty now reflected respect and admiration for genuine accomplishment and authentic advocacy. People began approaching to thank me for my leadership and ask about accessing our legal assistance programs, while Sheila stood frozen in place, clearly stunned by this unexpected reversal of her attack. As I watched Sheila's face cycle through shock recognition and finally a kind of desperate humiliation, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from justice finally being served through competence and community support, rather than manipulation and cruelty. My new role as regional coordinator for the Heritage Preservation Coalition came with unexpected benefits beyond the satisfaction of meaningful work and community recognition. It also provided me with access to resources and legal expertise that would prove invaluable in exposing the true extent of Sheila's fraud and the systematic way she'd been manipulating vulnerable elderly people throughout our community. When I mentioned to Rachel that I was concerned about Sheila's presence at development meetings and her apparent efforts to identify elderly landowners who might be pressured into selling heritage property, Rachel's response revealed that my suspicions were well-founded and potentially criminal in scope. "Clara," she said, with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades building legal cases, "I've been researching Mrs. Morrison's recent real estate activities, and I think you should see what I've discovered. She's been working with several development companies as an unofficial family mediator, helping them identify elderly landowners who might be vulnerable to pressure from younger relatives." What Rachel had uncovered was a pattern of exploitation that went far beyond Sheila's theft of my farmland. She'd been systematically targeting elderly property owners throughout the county, offering to help resolve family conflicts while actually working to facilitate fraudulent transfers that benefited development companies and their investors. This is organized elder abuse disguised as family mediation, Rachel explained as she spread documented evidence across my kitchen table. She identifies vulnerable elderly landowners, gains their trust by claiming to help with family disputes, then facilitates fraudulent transfers that strip them of property they've spent lifetimes preserving. The evidence Rachel had gathered painted a picture of a woman whose greed and manipulation had destroyed the lives of at least 7 elderly families over the past 3 years. Her pattern was consistent: identify elderly landowners experiencing family pressure to sell heritage property, offer to mediate family disputes, then manipulate legal documents to ensure that the land ended up in the hands of developers who paid her substantial commissions for her consulting services. The monthly town council meeting provided the perfect opportunity to share this information with people who had both the authority and moral obligation to act on it. As I presented our findings to the council members, I watched their faces change from polite interest to genuine horror as they absorbed the scope of Sheila's systematic exploitation of vulnerable elderly residents. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, standing to address the room with the same confidence I'd once used to present patient care protocols to skeptical hospital administrators. "Our community's heritage preservation efforts are being undermined by predators who use family relationships and legal manipulation to steal property from elderly residents who've spent lifetimes preserving our agricultural legacy." I distributed copies of Rachel's research to each council member, along with documented evidence of fraudulent transfers, forged signatures, and witness statements from elderly victims who'd been too ashamed or frightened to come forward until they learned they weren't alone in their experiences. But Sheila wasn't content to let her exposure proceed without attempting to fight back, and her counterattack came at the next council meeting with all the desperation of someone whose entire scheme was crumbling under public scrutiny. Standing before an audience of community leaders and local media representatives, she launched into a character assassination that revealed the true depths of her malice and her complete inability to accept responsibility for her own criminal behavior. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with the theatrical authority of someone accustomed to manipulating public opinion, "before we continue with tonight's agenda, I feel obligated to share some serious concerns about Clara Mitchell and her increasingly disturbing campaign of false accusations against innocent community members who've tried to help elderly residents manage their affairs responsibly." Her voice rose with each accusation, taking on the shrill quality of someone who knows they're losing but refuses to surrender gracefully. "Mrs. Mitchell has been systematically targeting successful business people with fabricated stories of fraud and exploitation, apparently as revenge for her own family's decision to help her transition to more appropriate living arrangements. She's not protecting elderly victims. She's creating them through her vindictive behavior toward anyone who questions her version of events." The audience shifted uncomfortably as Sheila's tirade continued, clearly disturbed by both the severity of her accusations and the increasingly erratic nature of her presentation. But I remained perfectly calm, having anticipated exactly this kind of desperate response from someone whose criminal activities had been exposed to public scrutiny. When Sheila finally paused for breath, I stood slowly and approached the council podium with the measured confidence of someone who'd spent decades managing hostile confrontations with difficult patients and their families. From my briefcase, I withdrew a small recording device that Rachel and I had prepared specifically for this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the now silent council chamber, "Mrs. Morrison's accusations deserve a response based on facts rather than emotions. I'd like to share some audio documentation that addresses her concerns about my credibility and motivations." The recording I played was Sheila's own voice, captured during a voicemail she'd left for Tom 2 weeks earlier when she thought she was speaking confidentially to her accomplice. In her own words, Sheila detailed her strategy for pressuring me into signing fraudulent documents, her coordination with development companies to identify vulnerable elderly landowners, and her complete fabrication of stories about my supposed mental decline. Tom, the trust document worked perfectly. Sheila's voice filled the council chamber with devastating clarity. Clara signed everything without reading it, just like we planned. Now we can move forward with the development deals, and she'll never be able to prove the transfer was fraudulent. The key is to keep people convinced that she's mentally unstable and can't be trusted to manage her own affairs. The recording continued with Sheila's detailed plans for expanding her exploitation scheme to other elderly landowners, including her admission that she'd been receiving substantial payments from development companies for her family mediation services. The reaction was immediate and absolute. Several council members began calling for law enforcement investigation, while others expressed outrage at the systematic exploitation of vulnerable elderly residents. The local newspaper reporter was taking detailed notes, clearly recognizing that this was front-page news that would expose a major scandal affecting multiple families. Rachel stepped forward with additional evidence we'd gathered from other victims, including sworn statements from elderly landowners who'd been targeted by Sheila's manipulation tactics, and documentary proof of her financial arrangements with development companies. This pattern of behavior, Rachel announced, represents a clear violation of multiple state laws regarding elder abuse fraud and conspiracy. We're prepared to file formal criminal complaints with the district attorney's office and civil lawsuits against all parties involved in this exploitation scheme. The council voted unanimously to ban Sheila from all future community development meetings and to request a full investigation by law enforcement and adult protective services. Local development companies began distancing themselves from her, immediately clearly recognizing that association with her scheme would destroy their own reputations and business prospects. As Sheila fled the council chamber in obvious shame and defeat, Rachel approached with legal papers already prepared for exactly this moment. "Mrs. Morrison," she called out loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you're being served with papers in the matter of Mitchell versus Morrison, a civil lawsuit for defamation conspiracy, elder abuse, and fraudulent property transfer." The papers scattered to the floor as Sheila stumbled toward the exit, her scheme exposed, and her reputation destroyed as thoroughly as she'd once tried to destroy mine. As I watched her retreat, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from justice finally being served through competent legal action and community support. The retired nurse who'd spent her career protecting vulnerable patients from those who would exploit them had just delivered the most important intervention of her lifetime. The phone call came exactly 60 hours after Sheila's public humiliation and expulsion from the town council meeting at 7:15 on a Wednesday morning, when I was preparing for a Heritage Coalition strategy session about expanding our legal assistance program to neighboring counties. I'd been expecting it, of course. The destruction of his wife's reputation and the exposure of their criminal conspiracy had undoubtedly sent Tom into the kind of panic that makes desperate people attempt even more desperate measures to salvage what remained of their crumbling schemes. I let the phone ring 4 times before answering, taking a moment to center myself and prepare for what I knew would be either a final attempt at manipulation or a last-ditch effort to somehow transform their criminal exposure into my responsibility. When I finally picked up the receiver, Tom's voice exploded through the connection with all the rage and fear I'd anticipated. "What the hell have you done?" he screamed, abandoning any pretense of brotherly concern or civilized discourse. "Sheila's been banned from every development meeting in the county. The district attorney's office is asking questions about our business dealings. Our attorney says we're facing potential criminal charges because of your vindictive campaign against innocent family members." His voice cracked with the strain of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing faster than he could comprehend the full scope of his legal and financial exposure. But I felt no sympathy for his distress. This was exactly the kind of consequence I'd been hoping to deliver when I'd first decided to stop protecting him from the truth about his own character and criminal history. "Tom." I said, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd finally taken control of a situation that had spiraled into chaos through his own greed and manipulation. "I haven't fabricated any evidence against you or Sheila. Every piece of information that's come to light consists of documented facts about your actual criminal behavior, not accusations I invented to damage your reputation." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, clearly struggling to process the reality that his victims had turned out to be far more capable and resourceful than he'd anticipated when he'd started his scheme to steal my property and destroy my independence. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from rage to the kind of desperate pleading that comes from someone who's finally realized the full scope of their miscalculation and the genuine legal consequences they were now facing. Clara, please, you have to understand that none of this was meant to hurt you personally. He said his words tumbling over each other in his haste to somehow undo the damage his crimes had created. Sheila and I were just trying to make practical decisions about family assets during a difficult time. We thought you were having problems managing the farmland and your finances, and we wanted to help you transition to a more manageable situation. The lies poured from his mouth with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent months convincing himself that theft was actually helping, that fraud was really protection, that systematic elder abuse was somehow justified by his imaginary concern for my welfare. You have to drop these legal actions against Sheila, he continued, his voice taking on the wheedling quality of someone trying to negotiate from a position of complete powerlessness. Think about what this scandal is doing to our entire family's reputation in the community. Think about Emily's future and how this public drama is affecting her relationships and career prospects. But the most pathetic part of his plea was still to come, delivered with the transparent desperation of someone who'd finally realized that their financial crimes had left them facing genuine consequences that couldn't be manipulated away through family guilt or emotional blackmail. Look, maybe we can work something out between us, he said, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper of someone proposing a deal he knew was inappropriate and probably illegal. Maybe there's a way we can resolve this privately without involving lawyers and prosecutors and all this public embarrassment. I know you've been living modestly since the property transfer, and I'm sure there's room for us to discuss some kind of financial arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. The audacity of his suggestion actually made me laugh out loud, a sound that clearly startled him, since he'd probably expected tears or anger rather than genuine amusement at his pathetic attempt to bribe his way out of criminal prosecution. Are you seriously trying to buy my silence about your criminal activities, Tom? I asked, still chuckling at the absurdity of someone who'd spent months calling me a burden, now attempting to offer me money in exchange for covering up his crimes. After everything you've done, after all the accusations you've made about my mental capacity and character, you think I can be purchased like some kind of commodity in your criminal enterprise? The silence that followed was profound and telling, the sound of someone finally realizing that they'd completely misjudged both their opponent and their own position in the legal proceedings they'd set in motion through their own greed and cruelty. When Tom spoke again, his voice carried the hollow desperation of someone making their final appeal before accepting total defeat and the criminal consequences that awaited him. Clara, I'm begging you, he said, and for the first time in our entire relationship, he actually sounded like he meant it. Rather than simply performing emotions he thought might manipulate me into compliance. Sheila's talking about leaving me if this investigation gets any worse. Emily won't speak to me because she's ashamed of the family scandal. The bank is threatening to foreclose on our house because of the legal fees and the money we had to return to cover fraudulent transactions. He paused, clearly expecting some expression of sympathy or concern for his self-inflicted suffering, but I remained silent, waiting for him to continue digging his own legal grave with his words. We could start over, he continued desperately, all of us together as a real family. You could come back to live with us, and we could put all this misunderstanding behind us. I could take care of you properly this time, make sure you have everything you need for your health and comfort. We could be the family that Dad always wanted us to be. The word family coming from his mouth was so obscene after everything he'd done that it actually made me feel physically ill. This was the same man who'd called me irrelevant, who'd stolen my farmland through fraud, who'd conspired with his wife to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could steal everything I owned. Tom, I said, my voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence that would never be appealed or overturned. Let me be absolutely clear about something. You are no brother of mine. You stopped being my brother the moment you chose Sheila's greed over 60 years of unconditional love and sacrifice. I could hear his sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone who'd been struck by a truth they weren't prepared to face, but I wasn't finished delivering the consequences his actions had earned. You chose to steal from me instead of honoring me. You chose to betray me instead of protecting me. You chose fraud over honesty, exploitation over gratitude, cruelty over family loyalty. Every decision you've made regarding our relationship has revealed exactly what kind of person you really are, and I want nothing more to do with that person. My voice grew stronger with each word, carrying the authority of someone who'd finally learned to protect herself from those who would destroy her for their own benefit. I'm blocking your number when this call ends, and if you attempt to contact me again, through any means, Rachel will have you arrested for harassment and witness intimidation. We are done, Tom, permanently and completely done. The last sound I heard before hanging up was something that might have been a sob or might have been a curse, but I felt no curiosity about which it was. I immediately blocked his number and called Rachel to have her notify law enforcement about Tom's attempt to bribe me into dropping criminal charges against his wife. As I set the phone down and returned to my Heritage Coalition work, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me like a warm blanket on a cold winter morning. The last tie to my old life of exploitation and manipulation had been severed, and I was finally completely free to build something meaningful and valuable with the years I had remaining. Outside my kitchen window, spring flowers were beginning to bloom in the community garden I'd helped establish for elderly residents who'd lost their homes to family fraud. Like me, those flowers had survived a harsh winter and were now reaching toward the sun with renewed strength and beauty. The metaphor wasn't lost on me, and for the first time in years, I found myself genuinely excited about what tomorrow might bring. The quarterly town hall meeting was meant to be a celebration of our Heritage Preservation Coalition's remarkable success, a chance for me to present our achievements in protecting elderly landowners from family fraud and securing their agricultural legacy for future generations. As the regional coordinator of our expanded program, I'd been invited to address the packed auditorium about our work and request additional county funding for legal assistance services that had already helped dozens of families avoid the kind of exploitation I'd survived. The municipal auditorium was filled with county commissioners, local farmers, community leaders, and elderly residents who understood that protecting heritage farmland required vigilant defense against those who would steal it for commercial development. I felt a deep sense of pride as I looked out at the assembled crowd, knowing that our coalition had fundamentally changed how our community approached elder protection and family financial abuse. I was reviewing my presentation notes backstage when I heard the unmistakable sound of aggressive footsteps and raised voices in the main auditorium. Through the curtain, I spotted a familiar figure making her way toward the front row with the kind of determined energy that suggested trouble was about to unfold in my moment of professional triumph. Emily had arrived uninvited and clearly unprepared for a respectful community discussion. Her appearance was disheveled, Her clothing suggested someone who'd been living rough, and her behavior indicated she was either under the influence of substances or experiencing some kind of emotional breakdown. She positioned herself prominently, where she could be seen and heard by everyone in attendance, clearly planning to disrupt my presentation with some kind of calculated attack. The sight of her sitting there like a legitimate community member, rather than the criminal accomplice she actually was, made my stomach clench with anxiety, but I forced myself to remain calm and focused. Whatever she was planning, I had Rachel beside me and a room full of people who'd already witnessed the evidence of my competence and integrity through months of successful advocacy work. When my turn came to speak, I approached the podium with the confidence that comes from knowing your accomplishments are genuine and your cause is just. But before I could begin my prepared remarks about our coalition's impact on protecting vulnerable, elderly residents, Emily stood up and began her assault with the theatrical authority of someone who'd spent considerable time planning this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, her voice carrying the practiced sincerity of someone who'd been rehearsing this performance for weeks. Before Clara Mitchell begins her presentation, I feel obligated as her family member to share some critical information about her credibility and the real motivation behind her so-called advocacy work. The room went silent with the uncomfortable tension that comes from witnessing an unexpected family confrontation in what should have been a professional community meeting. But Emily pressed forward with obvious satisfaction at having captured everyone's attention during what was supposed to be my moment of recognition. My name is Emily Thompson, and Clara is my aunt. She continued pulling out her phone to begin live streaming our confrontation to her social media followers. What she hasn't told you, what she's carefully hidden from this community, is that she's been systematically destroying our family through forged documents and fabricated stories of abuse designed to cover up her own financial crimes and mental instability. The lies poured from her mouth with the smooth confidence of someone who'd spent months crafting this narrative and convincing herself it was somehow true. She claimed that I'd forged Dad's journal to frame Tom for crimes he'd never committed, that I'd been stealing from the family farm's accounts for years, that my advocacy work was actually an elaborate scheme to gain sympathy and donations for myself, rather than helping other elderly victims. Clara Mitchell has been playing the victim while actually being the predator, Emily declared with venomous satisfaction, her phone camera capturing every moment of what she clearly expected would be my public destruction. She neglected our family when we needed her most, stole from my father's business accounts, then fabricated evidence of abuse when we tried to hold her accountable for her criminal behavior. Her voice rose with each accusation, taking on the shrill quality of someone performing for a social media audience rather than addressing a community meeting. The so-called journal she's been using as evidence was written by her, not my grandfather. The financial records she's presented have been manipulated and falsified. This woman has turned elder advocacy into a personal profit center while destroying the very families she claims to protect. But Emily's most devastating attack was her systematic destruction of my character through carefully crafted lies designed to make the audience question everything they thought they knew about my work and motivations. According to her fabricated narrative, I'd been mentally unstable for years, making wild accusations against innocent family members while refusing to accept help for my obvious cognitive decline. My Aunt Clara abandoned our family when my father needed her most. Emily continued her live stream, apparently attracting hundreds of viewers who were sharing her content across multiple social media platforms. She refused to help care for my stepmother Sheila when she was diagnosed with depression, then made false accusations about family financial abuse when they tried to help her manage her own deteriorating mental condition. The murmur that rippled through the audience was like a physical blow, the sound of doubt and suspicion spreading through a room that had been filled with respect and support just moments before. I watched faces that had been friendly and admiring shift into expressions of uncertainty and concern, clearly struggling to reconcile the accusations they were hearing with the professional presentation they'd been expecting. Several county commissioners began whispering among themselves, obviously troubled by questions about being associated with someone who might be mentally unstable or criminally fraudulent. The local newspaper reporter was taking detailed notes, clearly recognizing that family accusations against a community leader would make compelling front-page news regardless of their accuracy. Emily's social media followers were apparently sharing her live stream in real time because I could see people in the audience checking their phones and then looking at me with expressions of growing doubt and suspicion. The viral nature of her attack was amplifying its impact far beyond the people physically present in the auditorium. The evidence she's presented against my father and stepmother, Emily continued building toward her crescendo with obvious pleasure at the chaos she was creating, consists of fabricated documents and manipulated recordings designed to frame innocent family members who were trying to protect an elderly woman from her own poor judgment. She's not an advocate for elderly victims. She's a predator who's learned to weaponize sympathy to cover up her own crimes. As I stood there absorbing this calculated assault on my reputation and life's work, I felt the familiar weight of public judgment and social condemnation. These were people whose respect I'd earned through months of genuine advocacy work, and now they were looking at me like I might be the very kind of criminal they'd gathered to protect their community from. But something remarkable happened as I watched Emily deliver her character assassination with such obvious satisfaction and social media manipulation. Instead of the crushing humiliation and panic she clearly expected to provoke, I felt an almost supernatural calm descend over me like armor, forged from months of surviving her family's systematic abuse and learning to recognize manipulation when I saw it. This was exactly what Rachel and I had prepared for the final desperate gambit of a family whose criminal conspiracy was crumbling under legal investigation and community scrutiny. Emily had just provided the perfect stage for her own complete and final destruction, and she had no idea what kind of evidence I was prepared to present to this room full of officials and community leaders. I remained perfectly composed as she finished her tirade, letting her venom and desperation expose themselves to everyone present. When she finally paused to check her phone for social media reactions, I approached the microphone with the calm authority of someone who'd spent decades managing crisis situations with professionalism and grace. "Thank you, Emily," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent auditorium, "for providing such a perfect example of exactly the kind of family manipulation and psychological abuse that our Heritage Preservation Coalition exists to expose and prevent." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate as people realized they were about to witness something far more dramatic and revealing than a routine funding presentation. Rachel approached the podium with our carefully prepared evidence, and I knew that Emily Thompson was about to receive the education of her lifetime. The silence in the municipal auditorium was so complete, I could hear the old building's heating system humming in the background, and the soft click of Rachel opening her briefcase filled with evidence we'd prepared for exactly this moment. Emily stood frozen near the front row, her phone still recording what she clearly expected would be my complete breakdown, but finding instead a woman who looked at her with something approaching pity for the trap she just walked into with her lies and social media manipulation. Ladies and gentlemen, I began my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd spent 38 years managing crisis situations with patients and families in emotional distress. Emily has just provided you with a perfect demonstration of the kind of psychological manipulation and character assassination that makes family financial abuse so difficult to prosecute and so devastating to its victims. Rachel stepped forward with the first piece of evidence we'd prepared for exactly this confrontation. Dad's original journal, still in its handwritten form, with dated entries spanning 15 years of our family's history. The leather-bound book represented not just proof of Tom's embezzlement, but documentation of every sacrifice I'd made to protect our family's reputation and honor. "This is my father's personal journal," I announced, holding up the book that contained our family's complete financial history. Written in his own handwriting over a period of 15 years, and documenting not only my brother's embezzlement from Henderson's Hardware, but also the extraordinary measures our family took to protect him from criminal prosecution. I opened to the most damaging entry and began reading Dad's words aloud, letting his meticulous documentation speak for itself about the scope of Tom's theft and my willingness to sacrifice my own financial security to keep him out of prison. March 20th. 15 years ago, Clara has agreed to use her nursing salary to repay the money Tom stole from Henderson's Hardware, $8,300 over 6 months. She's taking a second mortgage on her house to cover the restitution, even though it means she'll be working until she's 70 to pay it off. The journal continued with Dad's growing concerns about Tom's character and his prediction that our sacrifices would never be appreciated or acknowledged. But the most powerful entries were the ones that documented my consistent pattern of putting family loyalty above my own financial security and personal happiness. But Rachel had saved even more devastating evidence for the second phase of our presentation. She produced sworn statements from 5 community members who'd witnessed Emily's campaign of lies and character assassination over the past several months, along with documentation that proved every one of her accusations was fabricated or deliberately distorted. These witness statements, Rachel announced with the authority of someone who'd spent decades building legal cases, come from neighbors, former colleagues, and community leaders who have personal knowledge of Clara's character and the actual facts surrounding her family's financial disputes. Each statement directly contradicts the accusations you've just heard. Margaret Foster, my neighbor for 8 years and a retired school principal, approached the podium to address Emily's lies personally. "I've known Clara Mitchell for 8 years," she said with obvious indignation, "and I can tell you that every accusation this young woman has made is a complete fabrication. Clara has never shown any signs of mental instability, has never neglected family responsibilities, and has certainly never stolen from anyone." Dr. Patricia Williams, my former supervisor at the hospital, provided even more damaging testimony about Emily's credibility and motives. "Clara Mitchell was one of the most ethical and competent nurses I supervised in 30 years of hospital administration," she announced to the assembled crowd. The idea that she would forge documents or fabricate evidence is so contrary to her character that it's actually offensive to anyone who knows her professional history. But the most devastating blow came when Rachel presented Emily's own social media history, including posts she'd deleted, but that had been preserved through screenshots and digital archives. The evidence showed a clear pattern of lies, contradictions, and obvious coordination with Tom and Sheila to destroy my reputation through manufactured scandals. These social media posts, Rachel announced, show Ms. Thompson systematically lying about her aunt's character and mental capacity while simultaneously asking her followers for money to help the family through this difficult time. And she's been monetizing her character assassination campaign while pretending to be a concerned family member. I stepped forward, then moving to the center of the room where Emily stood with her face growing paler by the moment, clearly realizing that her carefully planned attack had backfired in the most devastating way possible. "Emily," I said, addressing her directly for the first time since her arrival, "you've just accused me of the exact crimes that your father and stepmother committed against me. You've lied about our family's history, fabricated evidence of my supposed mental decline, and attempted to destroy my reputation to cover up your own family's criminal behavior." The room was dead silent now, everyone's attention focused on this family drama that had become a master class in recognizing and exposing psychological manipulation and elder abuse tactics. Several people were taking notes, obviously understanding that they were witnessing exactly the kind of manipulation their community protection efforts were designed to prevent. "You've just proven in front of this entire community that you're willing to lie, manipulate social media, and destroy an elderly woman's reputation to protect criminals from the consequences of their own actions." I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You've demonstrated exactly why family financial abuse is so difficult to prosecute and why elderly victims need community support to defend themselves against relatives who see them as obstacles rather than human beings." The transformation in the room's perception was immediate and absolute. Faces that had shown doubt and suspicion now reflected disgust and outrage directed entirely at Emily. People began standing and moving away from her as if her dishonesty might be contagious, isolating her in an expanding circle of social condemnation. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. Tom's former business partner, David Chen, stood up from his seat in the middle of the auditorium to address Emily's lies directly. "I want everyone in this room to know," he announced with obvious anger, "that Tom Thompson has been systematically lying to his business associates about his family situation for months. We've severed all business relationships with him because of his dishonest dealings and his treatment of his sister." David's statement was followed by a cascade of similar testimonials from community members who'd been deceived by Tom and Emily's campaign of lies. Local farmers spoke about Tom's attempts to pressure them into questionable land deals. Church members described Sheila's systematic character assassination of elderly congregants. Business owners detailed their growing suspicions about the family's financial practices. Emily's face had gone gray, and she swayed on her feet as if the weight of her public exposure was physically overwhelming her. When she tried to restart her social media live stream, apparently hoping to salvage something from her failed attack, several audience members called out in protest. "Turn off that camera," someone shouted from the back of the room. "Stop lying about this woman." The sentiment was quickly taken up by others until Emily found herself facing a room full of people who wanted nothing more than to see her acknowledge her deception and leave. She began backing toward the exit, then her confidence completely shattered by the overwhelming evidence of her lies and the community's rejection of her character assassination campaign. "This is all fake," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation and rage. "She's manipulated all of you just like she manipulated our family. You'll see the truth eventually." But her protests sounded like the ravings of someone who'd lost touch with reality, especially compared to the calm, documented evidence Rachel and I had presented. As she stumbled toward the door, Emily's phone slipped from her trembling hands and shattered on the auditorium floor, symbolically ending her social media campaign of lies. The applause that followed her departure was spontaneous and overwhelming. But more than that, it felt like vindication, not just for me, but for every elderly person who'd ever been victimized by family members who saw them as obstacles to inheritance rather than human beings deserving of love and respect. As I looked out at the room full of people who now understood exactly what we were fighting against, I felt a sense of justice so complete it was almost overwhelming. The retired nurse who'd spent her career protecting vulnerable patients from those who would exploit them had just delivered the most important intervention of her lifetime. 6 months had passed since Emily's humiliating public exposure at the town hall meeting, 6 months during which my life had settled into a rhythm of meaningful work and genuine community connections that felt like discovering myself for the first time in decades. The Heritage Preservation Coalition had expanded to serve 7 counties. Our legal assistance program had helped over 200 elderly landowners protect their property from family fraud, and I'd found a sense of purpose and belonging that had nothing to do with being someone's sister or caretaker. I was working in my restored garden on a crisp Saturday afternoon in early November, harvesting the last vegetables of the season and preparing my flower beds for winter, when I heard the sound of slow, hesitant footsteps on the gravel path that led to my front gate. Looking up from my work, I saw a figure approaching that took me several moments to recognize as the man who'd once held such devastating power over my emotions and financial security. Tom stood at my garden gate, looking like a ghost of his former self. His once confident posture collapsed into the hunched shoulders of someone who'd lost everything that had once defined his identity and social status. His expensive clothing had been replaced by worn jeans and a faded jacket that had seen better years, his carefully maintained appearance now reflecting the kind of neglect that comes from someone who stopped caring about how the world perceives him. He stood there for several minutes, clearly gathering courage for whatever performance he'd come to deliver, watching me work in my garden, with an expression that might have been genuine longing if I'd been naive enough to believe he was capable of such authentic emotion. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the broken quality of someone who'd spent months practicing this moment while his world crumbled around him. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly across the small space between us. "I know I don't deserve to be here. I know I don't deserve your time or your attention after everything I've done to hurt you and destroy our family. But I'm hoping you might give me just a few minutes to try to explain, to apologize, to somehow begin making amends for the terrible mistakes I've made." I continued working with my winter preparations, not acknowledging his presence beyond the slight tightening around my eyes that anyone who knew me well would recognize as barely contained irritation. He'd lost the right to call me by name the day he'd chosen greed over 60 years of sisterly love, and no amount of tears or pleading would restore that precious privilege. But Tom was nothing if not persistent, and he began the performance I'd been expecting for months. He opened my garden gate without invitation and approached with the kind of theatrical humility designed to evoke sympathy from anyone who might be watching our interaction from neighboring houses. "I've lost everything, Clara." He sobbed his words, punctuated by what appeared to be genuine tears streaming down his face. "Sheila left me when the criminal charges were filed. My business collapsed after the fraud investigation became public. Emily won't speak to me because she's ashamed of what her father became. I'm facing bankruptcy and possible prison time, and I have nowhere else to turn. The psychological manipulation was as obvious as it was pathetic, an attempt to transform himself from perpetrator to victim by claiming that his criminal behavior was actually the result of circumstances beyond his control, rather than his own fundamental character flaws. He painted a picture of a man who'd been led astray by a manipulative wife who'd made terrible decisions because he'd been desperate to provide for his family, who'd acted out of misguided love rather than simple greed and selfishness. Sheila convinced me that you were becoming confused and that we needed to take control of your property before you made decisions that would hurt the whole family. He continued, his voice taking on the wheedling quality of someone who'd convinced himself that his lies were actually truth. She made me believe that forcing you to sign those documents was protecting you from yourself, that taking control of the farmland was preventing it from being lost to taxes or poor management. But even as he delivered these manufactured excuses with apparent sincerity, his true motivation began to emerge like a snake shedding its skin. "I've been thinking about how we might move forward together," he said, his voice taking on the conspiratorial tone of someone proposing a business arrangement rather than seeking genuine reconciliation. "Maybe there's a way we could help each other through these difficult times. You've built a good reputation here, and I could contribute to that. I could help with your advocacy work, maybe even use my business experience to expand your programs to other communities." The request for money came disguised as an offer of partnership wrapped in language about family reconciliation and shared purpose, but its true nature was as transparent as glass. Tom was offering to help me continue the very advocacy work that had exposed his crimes, apparently believing I was stupid enough to fall for such an obvious manipulation attempt. "If you could see your way to helping me get back on my feet financially," he said, dropping the pretense entirely as his desperation overwhelmed his calculated approach. "I could start over somewhere else, maybe even change my name and create a new identity where the criminal charges can't follow me. We could be a real family again, Clara. We could put all this pain and legal trouble behind us and rebuild what we lost." As I knelt there in my garden, listening to him attempt to monetize his own criminal conviction while simultaneously asking me to finance his escape from the consequences of his actions, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day I'd walked out of his house with Dad's journal in my possession. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no sisterly instinct to comfort someone who was obviously suffering from the results of his own choices. Tom had become a complete stranger to me, someone whose pain and desperation were no more relevant to my life than the troubles of any other criminal I might read about in the newspaper. The emotional connection that had once bound us together had been severed by his own actions, cut away piece by piece through months of systematic abuse and betrayal. "Tom," I said, finally looking up from my gardening to meet his eyes with the kind of detached curiosity one might reserve for studying an interesting but ultimately irrelevant specimen. "You broke our family when you chose to steal from me instead of loving me. You destroyed 60 years of shared history when you decided that money was more important than the sister who'd spent her entire life protecting and supporting you. Find your own path forward, because it doesn't include me." I stood up slowly, brushing soil from my gardening gloves with the same casual efficiency I'd once used to dismiss difficult patients who refused to follow medical advice. "Rachel has already prepared legal documents that prohibit you from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my property. Any violation will result in your immediate arrest and additional criminal charges that will make your current legal problems seem insignificant by comparison. Tom's face cycled through disbelief rage and finally a kind of desperate panic as he realized that his final attempt at manipulation had not only failed, but had actually resulted in additional legal restrictions on his behavior. "You can't throw away 60 years of being my sister," he whispered, his voice breaking with what might have been genuine despair. "Family is supposed to forgive each other, support each other through difficult times. I'm still your brother no matter what mistakes I've made." But I was already walking toward my house, leaving him standing in my garden like the trespasser he'd become. As if summoned by our conversation, Rachel appeared at my front door with legal papers already prepared for exactly this moment. "Mr. Thompson," she said with professional authority, approaching Tom with the measured confidence of someone who dealt with many desperate criminals in her long career, "you're being served with a no-contact order that prohibits you from approaching Ms. Mitchell or her property. Any violation will result in your immediate arrest and additional charges for harassment and witness intimidation." The papers fell from Tom's nerveless hands as he stared at me with the expression of someone watching their last hope disappear forever. "Clara, please," he whispered one final time, "don't let it end like this between us." But I was already closing my front door, shutting out his voice and his presence with the same finality I'd once used to end conversations with manipulative patients who refused to accept appropriate boundaries. "You ended it the day you chose to destroy me," I said through the closing gap. "Now live with the consequences." The silence that followed was the most peaceful sound I'd heard in years, broken only by the distant sound of Tom's footsteps retreating down my driveway and Rachel's satisfied voice as she confirmed that the restraining order would be enforced by local law enforcement. As I returned to my garden and my winter preparations, I felt a profound sense of completion settle over me like warm sunshine on a perfect autumn day. The last vestige of my old life, the final attempt at manipulation from someone who'd never understood my worth, had been dealt with permanently and decisively. As I sit in my restored farmhouse this evening, surrounded by letters from elderly people, our Heritage Preservation Coalition has helped protect from family fraud, and photographs from our support group's latest community project. I can barely recognize the broken woman who'd signed away her birthright 6 months ago in a moment of trust and vulnerability that nearly destroyed everything she'd spent a lifetime building. My days now overflow with meaningful work that feeds my soul in ways I never experienced during my years of unappreciated sacrifice and one-sided devotion to ungrateful family members. 4 mornings a week, I coordinate our expanded legal assistance program, training social workers and law enforcement officers to recognize the subtle signs of family financial manipulation that destroy so many elderly lives. 3 afternoons each week, I mentor young nurses at the community college, sharing hard-won wisdom about protecting vulnerable patients and maintaining professional boundaries with difficult families. The farmland that Tom and Sheila tried to steal has been restored to my ownership through Rachel's brilliant legal work, and I've placed it in a conservation trust that will preserve it for future generations while preventing any family member from ever again using it as a weapon against me. The community garden I've established on part of the property serves elderly residents who've lost their homes to family fraud, giving them a place to grow food and flowers while rebuilding their sense of purpose and self-worth. My small home reflects the woman I've become rather than the person I thought I was supposed to be for other people's benefit. The walls are covered with certificates recognizing my advocacy work, photographs of elderly landowners I've helped protect their heritage and artwork created by support group members who found their voices through our shared experiences of survival and recovery. I've learned that I am infinitely stronger than I ever imagined possible, that the woman who'd spent 60 years protecting an ungrateful brother from consequences was more than capable of protecting herself and others from exploitation and abuse. I no longer define myself by other people's approval or measure my worth by their gratitude or love. The validation I need comes from within, from the knowledge that I've survived the worst kind of family betrayal and emerged with my integrity intact and my capacity for authentic relationships restored to appropriate boundaries. The philosophical lesson that emerged from my journey through devastating betrayal and back to authentic happiness is both simple and profound. Betrayal scars deeply cutting through the very foundation of trust and love that makes human connection possible and meaningful. But those scars also reveal reserves of strength and resilience you never knew you possessed, inner resources that lie dormant until circumstances demand their emergence. You must guard your heart carefully, learning to distinguish between those who truly value your worth and those who view you merely as a resource to be exploited until depleted. But most importantly, you must never stop trusting in your own inner light, your own value, your own right to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who chooses to walk away from your life. Peace comes not from others' approval or gratitude or even their love, though authentic relationships can enrich your existence immeasurably. True tranquility emerges from standing tall in your own worth, from building a life that reflects your values rather than other people's expectations, from refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your spirit or exploits your generous nature. As I tend my garden each morning, deadheading roses and planting new seeds for next year's harvest, I often wonder how many other people might discover their own hidden strength if they could see themselves through eyes unclouded by others' manipulation and cruelty. My flowers bloom in defiant beauty despite the harsh seasons they've survived, and so do I. In the end, that may be the most profound victory of all.